Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking to you about tension, which is also known as gauge. It's basically the number of stitches and rows which make up a particular width or length in your knitted sample. In other words, it's the measure of the width and the height of your stitches. The size of a stitch will vary depending on the yarn, the size of the needles, and the way you control the yarn. Now, most knitters control the yarn tension by weaving it through their fingers, and each knitter has a different way of holding the yarn, which can vary depending on the type of yarn and the needles used. So as no two knitters work alike, one knitter may have to use a different needle size, even as much as 2 or 3 times larger or smaller than another to obtain the same tension. Another factor affecting tension is yarn substitution. A different yarn can alter the tension as well as producing a different texture. Surprisingly, the type of needle that you use can also affect the tension. So you may obtain a slightly different tension using metal needles than you would with either wood or plastic ones. So be sure to use the same needles for your swatch as throughout your project. If you don't achieve the exact tension, you will alter the size and the texture of your finished garment potentially, which is why it's important to check your tension before beginning your project. So how do you do that? How do you make a tension swatch? Well, you work a small swatch in the pattern that you're going to be using and you measure it. So we usually work the number of stitches and rows to 10 centimeters or 4 inches is the most common way of measuring tension. And most patterns will give you an ideal tension for that. But it's better to make a slightly bigger square. So cast on a few more stitches and work a few more rows than the pattern suggests. And then that way a true tension can be measured in the center of the square, as the outside edges can distort the work. So when you've completed the swatch, you take a ruler and measure the center 10 centimeters across the square and mark with pins, and you do the same vertically. And then using the point of a needle, count the number of stitches and rows between the pins. So if you end up with more rows or stitches than the pattern suggests, then your tension is too tight and you should switch to a larger needle. There are fewer stitches or rows, then switch to a smaller needle. Quite often the tension is given in stocking stitch, but if the tension in the pattern calls for a specific pattern stitch to be worked, then you should do that as well. So what happens if you can't obtain the tension? What if you get one but not the other? Well, in many projects, the most important tension to match is the stitch tension. And that's because quite often a pattern will say something like, continue in pattern until the work measures 25 centimeters. So as long as you have the correct width, in other words, the correct stitch tension, then the row tension isn't as important because you are working to a particular length anyway. This isn't always the case, however, as some patterns may say to work a certain number of rows in a particular section of the pattern. This is often the case with color work or charted patterns. So in this case, use the needle size, which gives you the closest you can get to both the stitch and row tensions given in the pattern. Now, finally, if you feel you're way off on your tension, then there is another alternative, and that is to follow the instructions for a smaller or larger size of the pattern. So if you're getting more stitches and rows to 10 centimeters than the pattern state, then you are knitting tighter than the given tension. So you may need to go up a size in the pattern to get your required results. If you have less stitches and rows to 10 centimeters, then you are knitting looser than the given tension, and so you may need to go down a size in pattern to get your results. But why does it matter so much? Here is an example of tension being slightly out and making quite a big difference. So supposing the tension in the pattern was given as 20 stitches and 30 rows for 10 centimeters or 4 inches. Let's say the back has 100 stitches across it. If we need to find out how wide that is going to be, if we divide 100 by 20, we get 5, and that tells us we've got 5 lots of 10 centimeters. So it's going to be 50 centimeters across. Now let's suppose we had 1 stitch difference and our tension was 19 stitches by, say, 28 rows. I'm not too worried about that at the moment, but just that 1 stitch different, let's see what that makes. So now if we take the 100 stitches and we divide by 19 instead of 20, then my calculator tells me we get 5.263. So we have that many lots of 10 centimeters. In other words, we have 52.63 centimeters as the width across the back. Okay, so that's 2.63 centimeters difference. But that's not all. If this was a sweater and the front was the same, which it would be, then all around the width should really be 100 centimeters, but we're going to get 105.2. So we're going to get a whole 5 centimeters more around the body of the garment than we should have, which is quite a lot. The next video shows you how to work a tension square and how to measure it. And so I'll meet you back there.